The 613 Commandments. Original list by Rabbi Moses Ben Maimon. Read by Cifmore. Part 2 of 2. Commandments 308 to 613. Commandment 308, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 32. Do no prohibited labor on the Day of Atonement. Commandment 309, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 35. Rest on the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 310, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 35. Do no prohibited labor on the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 311, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 36. Rest on the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 312, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 36. Do no prohibited labor on the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 313, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 40. Take up lulav and etrog all 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 314, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 42. Dwell in a temporary shelter for the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 315, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 7. Rest on the first day of Passover. Commandment 316, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 7. Do no prohibited labor on the first day of Passover. Commandment 317, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 8. Rest on the 7th day of Passover. Commandment 318, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 8. Do not do prohibited labor on the 7th day of Passover. Commandment 319, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 10. The Sanhedrin must sanctify the 50th year. Commandment 320, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 11. Do not work the soil during the 50th year. Commandment 321, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 11. Do not reap in the normal manner that which grows wild in the 50th year. Commandment 322, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 11. Do not pick grapes which grew wild in the normal manner in the 50th year. Commandment 323, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 14. Buy and sell according to Adonai's law. Commandment 324, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 14. Do not overcharge or underpay for an article. Commandment 325, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 17. Do not insult or harm anybody with words. Commandment 326, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 23. Do not sell the land in Israel indefinitely. Commandment 327, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 24. Carry out the lands of sold family properties in the 50th year. Commandment 328, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 29. Carry out the laws of houses in walled cities. Commandment 329, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 34. Do not sell the fields of the Levites, but they shall belong to the Levites before and after the Jubilee year. Commandment 330, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 37. Do not lend with interest. Commandment 331, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 39. Do not have a Jewish slave do menial slave labor. Commandment 332, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 4. Do not work the land during the 7th year. Commandment 333, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 4. Do not work with trees to produce fruit during the 7th year. Commandment 334, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 42. Do not sell a Hebrew as a non-Hebrew is sold. Commandment 335, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 43. Do not work a Hebrew slave oppressively. Commandment 336, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 46. Canaanite slaves must work forever unless injured in one of their limbs. Commandment 337, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 5. Do not reap crops which grow wild during the 7th year in the normal manner. Commandment 338, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 5. Do not gather grapes which grow wild during the 7th year in the normal way. Commandment 339, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 53. Do not allow a non-Jew to work a Hebrew slave oppressively. Commandment 340, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 8. The Sanhedrin must count 7 groups of 7 years. Commandment 341, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 9. Blow the shofar on the 10th day of the 7th month to free the slaves. Commandment 342, Vayikra, chapter 26, verse 1. Do not bow down on smooth stone. Commandment 343, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 10. Do not substitute another beast for one set apart for sacrifice. Commandment 344, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 10. Both an animal offered as a substitution as well as an animal set apart for sacrifice retain their consecration. Commandment 345, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 12 to 13. Estimate the value of consecrated animals. Commandment 346, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 14. Estimate the value of consecrated houses. Commandment 347, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 16. Estimate the value of consecrated fields. Commandment 348, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 2 to 8. Estimate the value of people as determined by the Torah. Commandment 349, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 26. Do not change consecrated animals from one type of offering to another. Commandment 350, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 28. Carry out the laws of interdicting possessions. Commandment 351, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 28. Do not sell interdicted possessions. Commandment 352, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 28. Do not redeem interdicted possessions. Commandment 353, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 32. Separate the tithe of animals. Commandment 354, Vayikra, chapter 27, verse 33. Do not redeem the tithe. Commandment 355, Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 15. Do not put oil on the meal offering of a woman suspected of adultery. Commandment 356, Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 15. Do not put frankincense on the meal offering of a woman suspected of adultery. Commandment 357, Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 2. Send the impure person from the temple. Commandment 358, Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 3. An impure person must not enter the temple. Commandment 359, Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 30. Fulfill the laws of a woman suspected of adultery. Commandment 360, Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 7. Repent and confess wrongdoings. Commandment 361, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 23. The priests must bless the Israelite nation daily. Commandment 362, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 3. The Nazirite must not drink wine, wine mixtures, or wine vinegar. Commandment 363, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 3. The Nazirite must not eat fresh grapes. Commandment 364, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 3. The Nazirite must not eat raisins. Commandment 365, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 4. The Nazirite must not eat grape seeds. Commandment 366, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 4. The Nazirite must not eat grape skins. Commandment 367, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 5. The Nazirite must let his hair grow. Commandment 368, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 5. The Nazirite must not cut his hair. Commandment 369, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 6. The Nazirite must not be under the same roof as a corpse. Commandment 370, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 7. The Nazirite must not come in contact with the dead. Commandment 371, Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 9. The Nazirite must shave his head after bringing sacrifices upon completion of his Nazirite period. Commandment 372, Bamidbar, chapter 7, verse 9. The Levites must transport the ark on their shoulders. Commandment 373, Bamidbar, chapter 9, verse 11. Slaughter the second Passover lamb. Commandment 374, Bamidbar, chapter 9, verse 11. Eat the second Passover lamb on the night of the 15th day of the month after Passover. Commandment 375, Bamidbar, chapter 9, verse 12. Do not break any bones from the second Passover lamb offering. Commandment 376, Bamidbar, chapter 9, verse 12. Do not leave the meat of the second Passover lamb over until morning. Commandment 377, Bamidbar, chapter 10, verse 9. Afflict and cry out before Adonai in times of catastrophe. Commandment 378, Bamidbar, chapter 15, verse 20. Set aside a portion of dough for a priest. Commandment 379, Bamidbar, chapter 15, verse 38. Have tassels on four-cornered garments. Commandment 380, Bamidbar, chapter 15, verse 39. Do not follow the whims of your heart and what your eyes see. Commandment 381, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 15. Redeem firstborn sons and give the money to the priest. Commandment 382, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 17. Do not redeem the firstborn animals. Commandment 383, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 2. Guard the temple area. Commandment 384, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 23. The Levites must work in the temple. Commandment 385, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 24. Set aside a tithe each planting year and give it to a Levite. Commandment 386, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 26. The Levite must set aside a tenth of his tithe. Commandment 387, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 3. No Levite must do another's work of either another priest or another Levite. Commandment 388, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 4. One who is not a priest must not serve. Commandment 389, Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 5. Do not leave the temple unguarded. Commandment 390, Bamidbar, chapter 19, verse 14. Carry out the laws of impurity of the dead. Commandment 391, Bamidbar, chapter 19, verse 2. Carry out the procedure of the red heifer. Commandment 392, Bamidbar, chapter 19, verse 21. Carry out the laws of the sprinkling of water. Commandment 393, Bamidbar, chapter 27, verse 8. Carry out the laws of order of inheritance. Commandment 394, Bamidbar, chapter 28, verse 11. Bring additional offerings on the first day of the month. Commandment 395, Bamidbar, chapter 28, verse 19. Bring additional offerings on Passover. Commandment 396, Bamidbar, chapter 28, verses 26 to 31. Bring additional offerings on the Feast of Weeks. Commandment 397, Bamidbar, chapter 28, verse 3. Offer 2 lambs for sacrifice every day. Commandment 398, Bamidbar, chapter 28, verse 9. Bring 2 additional lambs as burnt offering on the Sabbath. Commandment 399, Bamidbar, chapter 29, verse 1. Blow the shofar on the Feast of Trumpets. Commandment 400, Bamidbar, chapter 29, verse 1 to 2. Bring additional offerings on the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 401, Bamidbar, chapter 29, verses 12 to 13. Bring additional offerings on the Feast of Trumpets. Commandment 402, Bamidbar, chapter 29, verses 35 to 36. Bring additional offerings on the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 403, Bamidbar, chapter 29, verse 8. Bring additional offerings on the Day of Atonement. Commandment 404, Bamidbar, chapter 30, verse 2. Do not break oaths or vows. Commandment 405, Bamidbar, chapter 30, verses 3 to 5. For oaths and vows annulled, there are laws of annulling vows explicit in the Torah. Commandment 406, Bamidbar, chapter 35, verse 12. Do not kill a murderer before he or she stands trial. Commandment 407, Bamidbar, chapter 35, verse 12. Do not pity a person who pursues an individual accused of murder. Commandment 408, Bamidbar, chapter 35, verse 2. Give the Levites cities to inhabit in their surrounding fields. Commandment 409, Bamidbar, chapter 39, verse 25. The court must send the accidental murderer to a city of refuge. Commandment 410, Bamidbar, chapter 35, verse 31. Do not accept monetary restitution to atone for a murder. Commandment 411, Bamidbar, chapter 35, verse 32. Do not accept monetary restitution instead of being sent to a city of refuge. Commandment 412, Devarim, chapter 1, verse 17. Do not appoint judges who are not familiar with judicial procedure. Commandment 413, Devarim, chapter 1, verse 17. The judge must not fear a violent man in judgment. Commandment 414, Devarim, chapter 5, verse 18. Do not desire another's possessions. Commandment 415, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 16. Do not test the prophet unduly. Commandment 416, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 4. Know that Adonai is one, a complete unity. Commandment 417, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 5. Love Adonai. Commandment 418, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 7. Learn Adonai's commandments. Commandment 419, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 7. Recite the Shema twice daily. Commandment 420, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 8. Wear tefillin on the head. Commandment 421, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 8. Bind tefillin on the arm. Commandment 412, Devarim, chapter 6, verse 9. Write the commandments on each doorpost. Commandment 423, Devarim, chapter 7, verse 2. Do not make a covenant with idolaters. Commandment 424, Devarim, chapter 7, verse 2. Do not show favor to idolaters. Commandment 425, Devarim, chapter 7, verse 25. Do not derive benefit from ornaments of idols. Commandment 426, Devarim, chapter 7, verse 26. Do not derive benefit from idols and their accessories. Commandment 427, Devarim, chapter 7, verse 3. Do not marry non-Jews. Commandment 428, Devarim, chapter 8, verse 10. Bless the Almighty after eating. Commandment 429, Devarim, chapter 10, verse 19. Show love towards converts. Commandment 430, Devarim, chapter 10, verse 20. Fear Adonai reverently. Commandment 431, Devarim, chapter 10, verse 20. Cleave to those who know Adonai. Commandment 432, Devarim, chapter 10, verse 20. Swear in Adonai's name to confirm the truth when deemed necessary by court. Commandment 433, Devarim, chapter 12, verse 11. Offer all sacrifices in the temple. Commandment 434, Devarim, chapter 12, verse 13. Do not offer any sacrifices outside the courtyard. Commandment 435, Devarim, chapter 12, verse 15. Redeem dedicated animals which have become disqualified. Commandment 436, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 15 to 16. Do not eat the meat of minor sacrifices before sprinkling the blood. Commandment 437, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 17 to 18. Do not eat second tithe grains outside Jerusalem. Commandment 438, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 17 to 18. Do not eat second tithe wine products outside Jerusalem. Commandment 439, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 17 to 18. Do not eat second tithe oil outside Jerusalem. Commandment 440, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 17 to 18. The priests must not eat the first fruits outside Jerusalem. Commandment 441, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 17 to 18. Do not eat the meat of a burnt offering away from the temple. Commandment 442, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 17 to 18. The priest must not eat the meat of an offering outside the temple courtyard. Commandment 443, Devarim, chapter 12, verses 17 to 18. The priests must not eat unblemished firstborn animals outside Jerusalem. Commandment 444, Devarim, chapter 12, verse 19. Do not refrain from rejoicing with and giving gifts to the Levites. Commandment 445, Devarim, chapter 12, verse 2. Destroy idols and their accessories. Commandment 446, Devarim chapter 12, verse 21. Ritually slaughter an animal before eating it. Commandment 447. Devarim chapter 12, verse 23. Do not eat meat torn off a living creature. Commandment 448. Devarim chapter 12, verse 26. Bring all sacrifices from outside Israel to the temple. Commandment 449. Devarim chapter 12, verse 32. Do not add any commandments to the Torah. Commandment 450. Devarim chapter 12, verse 32. Do not diminish any commandments from the Torah. Commandment 451. Devarim chapter 12, verse 4. Do not destroy objects associated with Adonai's name. Commandment 452. Devarim chapter 12, verses 5 to 6. Bring all avowed and freewill offerings to the temple on the first subsequent festival. Commandment 453. Devarim chapter 13, verses 12 to 15. Do not turn a city to idolatry. Commandment 454. Devarim chapter 13, verses 12 to 15. Do not entice an individual to idol worship. Commandment 455. Devarim chapter 13, verse 14. Do not prophesy in the name of idolatry. Commandment 456. Devarim chapter 13, verse 15. Carefully interrogate a witness in a trial. Commandment 457. Devarim chapter 13, verse 17. Burn a city that has turned to idol worship. Commandment 458. Devarim chapter 13, verse 17. Do not rebuild an idolatrous city that has been burned down. Commandment 459. Devarim chapter 13, verse 18. Do not derive benefit from an idolatrous city. Commandment 460. Devarim chapter 13, verse 4. Do not listen to a false prophet. Commandment 461. Devarim chapter 13, verse 9. Do not love those who entice others into idolatry. Commandment 462. Devarim chapter 13, verse 9. Do not cease hating an idolater. Commandment 463. Devarim chapter 13, verse 9. Do not save an idolater from execution. Commandment 464. Devarim chapter 13, verse 9. Do not say anything in an idolater's defense. Commandment 465. Devarim chapter 13, verse 9. Do not refrain from incriminating an idolater. Commandment 466. Devarim chapter 14, verse 1. Do not tear or cut the skin in mourning. Commandment 467. Devarim chapter 14, verse 1. Do not make a bald spot in mourning. Commandment 468. Devarim chapter 14, verse 11. Examine the signs of fowl to distinguish between those are kosher and non-kosher. Commandment 469. Devarim chapter 14, verse 19. Do not eat non-kosher flying insects. Commandment 470. Devarim chapter 14, verse 21. Do not eat of any animal that dies of natural causes. Commandment 471. Devarim chapter 14, verse 22. Set aside the second tithe. Commandment 472. Devarim chapter 14, verse 28. Separate the tithe for the poor. Commandment 473. Devarim chapter 14, verse 3. Do not eat sacrifices which have become unfit or blemished. Commandment 474. Devarim chapter 15, verse 13. Do not send a Jewish slave away empty-handed. Commandment 475, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 14. Give a Jewish slave gifts when he goes free. Commandment 476, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 19. Do not work consecrated animals. Commandment 477, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 19. Do not shear the fleece of consecrated animals. Commandment 478, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 2. Release all loans during the 7th year. Commandment 479, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 2. Do not pressure or claim from the borrower during the 7th year. Commandment 480, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 3. Press the idolater for payment of a loan. Commandment 481, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 7. Do not withhold charity from the poor. Commandment 482, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 8. Give charity to those in need. Commandment 483, Devarim, chapter 15, verse 9. Do not refrain from lending immediately before the release of loans for fear of monetary loss. Commandment 484, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 14. Rejoice on Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles, and bring a peace offering. Commandment 485, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 16. Go to the temple on Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Commandment 486, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 16. Do not appear at the temple during Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles without offerings. Commandment 487, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 18. Appoint judges. Commandment 488, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 21. Do not plant a tree in the temple courtyard. Commandment 489, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 22. Do not erect a pillar in the public space of worship. Commandment 490, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 3. Do not eat leavened food on the afternoon of the 14th day of Nisan. Commandment 491, Devarim, chapter 16, verse 4. Do not leave the meat of the Passover lamb of the 14th until the 16th. Commandment 492, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 1. Do not offer a temporarily blemished animal. Commandment 493, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 11. Act according to the ruling of the Sanhedrin. Commandment 494, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 11. Do not deviate from the word of the Sanhedrin. Commandment 495, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 15. Appoint a king from Israel. Commandment 496, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 15. Do not appoint a convert as king. Commandment 497, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 16. The king must not have too many horses. Commandment 498, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 16. Do not dwell permanently in Egypt. Commandment 499, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 17. The king must not have too many wives. Commandment 500, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 17. The king must not have too much silver and gold. Commandment 501, Devarim, chapter 17, verse 18. The king must have a separate book of the Torah for himself. Commandment 502, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 1. The tribe of Levi must not be given a portion of the land of Israel. Commandment 503, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 1. The Levites must not take a share in the spoils of war. Commandment 504, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 10. Do not go into a trance to foresee events. Commandment 505, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 10. Do not perform acts of magic. Commandment 506, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 11. Do not mutter incantations. Commandment 507, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 11. Do not attempt to contact the dead. Commandment 508, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 11. Do not consult ghosts or spirits. Commandment 509, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 11. Do not consult magicians or wizards. Commandment 510, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 15. Listen to the prophet speaking in Adonai's name. Commandment 511, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 20. Do not prophesy falsely in the name of Adonai. Commandment 512, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 22. Do not be afraid of killing the false prophet. Commandment 513, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 3. Give the shoulder, 2 cheeks, and stomach of slaughtered animals to a priest. Commandment 514, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 4. Set aside a gift of food for the priest. Commandment 515, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 4. Give the first shearing of sheep to a priest. Commandment 516, Devarim, chapter 18, verse 6 to 8. The work of the priest's shifts must be equal during holidays. Commandment 517, Devarim, chapter 19, verse 13. A judge must not pity the murderer or assaulter at a trial. Commandment 518, Devarim, chapter 19, verse 14. Do not move a boundary marker to steal someone's property. Commandment 519, Devarim, chapter 19, verse 15. Do not accept testimony from a lone witness. Commandment 520, Devarim, chapter 19, verse 17. A witness must not serve as a judge in capital crimes. Commandment 521, Devarim, chapter 19, verse 19. Punish the false witness as they have tried to punish the defendant. Commandment 522, Devarim, chapter 19, verse 3. Designate cities of refuge and prepare routes of access. Commandment 523, Devarim, chapter 20, verse 10. Offer peace offerings to the inhabitants of a city while holding siege, and treat them according to the Torah if they accept the terms. Commandment 524, Devarim, chapter 20, verse 16. Do not let any of the 7 Canaanite nations remain alive. Commandment 525, Devarim, chapter 20, verse 17. Destroy the 7 Canaanite nations. Commandment 526, Devarim, chapter 20, verse 19. Do not destroy fruit trees even during siege. Commandment 527, Devarim, chapter 20, verse 2. Appoint a priest to speak with the soldiers during a war. Commandment 528, Devarim, chapter 20, verse 3. Do not panic and retreat during battle. Commandment 529. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 11. Keep the laws of the captive woman. Commandment 530. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 14. Do not sell a captive woman into slavery. Commandment 531. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 14. Do not retain a captive woman for servitude after having sexual relations with her. Commandment 532. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 18. Do not be a rebellious son. Commandment 533. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 22. The courts must hang those stoned for blasphemy or idolatry. Commandment 534. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 23. Bury the executed on the day they are killed. Commandment 535. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 23. Do not delay burial overnight. Commandment 536. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 4. Break the neck of the calf by the river valley following an unsolved murder. Commandment 537. Devarim, chapter 21, verse 4. Do not plant or work the river valley where an unsolved murder occurred. Commandment 538. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 1. Return the lost object. Commandment 539. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 10. Do not work different animals together. Commandment 540. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 11. Do not wear cloth woven from wool and linen. Commandment 541. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 13. Marry a wife by means of a marriage agreement and sanctification. Commandment 542. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 19. A man who slanders his wife with accusations of adultery must remain married to his wife. Commandment 543. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 19. A man who slanders his wife with accusations of adultery must not divorce her. Commandment 544. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 24. The courts must carry out the death penalty of stoning. Commandment 545. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 26. The courts must not punish anybody who is forced to commit a crime. Commandment 546. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 29. One who seduces a maiden must marry the maiden if she chooses. Commandment 547. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 29. A seducer that marries the maiden he seduces is never allowed to divorce her. Commandment 548. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 3. Do not ignore a lost object. Commandment 549. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 4. Help others load their beast. Commandment 550. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 4. Do not leave others distraught with their burdens, but help either load or unload. Commandment 551. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 5. Men must not wear women's clothing. Commandment 552. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 5. Women must not wear men's clothing. Commandment 553. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 6. Send away the mother bird before taking its children. Commandment 554. Devarim, chapter 22, verse 7. Release a mother bird if she was taken from the nest. Commandment 555, Devarim, chapter 22, verse 8. Do not allow pitfalls and obstacles to remain on your property. Commandment 556, Devarim, chapter 22, verse 8. Make a guardrail around flat roofs. Commandment 557, Devarim, chapter 22, verse 9. Do not eat diverse seeds planting in a vineyard. Commandment 558, Devarim, chapter 22, verse 9. Do not plant grains or greens in a vineyard. Commandment 559, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 1. Do not let a eunuch marry into the Jewish people. Commandment 560, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 11. An impure person must not enter the Temple Mount area. Commandment 561, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 13. Prepare latrines outside the camps. Commandment 562, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 14. Prepare a shovel for each soldier to dig with. Commandment 563, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 16. Do not extradite a slave who has fled the biblical land of Israel. Commandment 564, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 16. Do not wrong a slave who has come to the land of Israel for refuge. Commandment 565, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 17. Do not have sexual relations with a woman not married by means of a marriage agreement and sanctification. Commandment 566, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 18. Do not offer animals bought with the wages of a harlot or the wages of a dog. Commandment 567, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 20. Do not borrow with interest. Commandment 568, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 21. Lend to and borrow from idolaters with interest. Commandment 569, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 22. Do not withhold payment incurred by any vow. Commandment 570, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 23. Fulfill what you uttered and do what you have vowed. Commandment 571, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 25. The hired worker may eat from the unharvested crops where he works. Commandment 572, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 25. The worker must not take more than he can eat. Commandment 573, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 26. The worker must not eat while on hired time. Commandment 574, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 3. Do not let a child born due to an illegal relationship marry into the Jewish people. Commandment 575, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 4. Do not let a Moabite and an Ammonite male marry into the Jewish people. Commandment 576, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 7. Do not offer peace to Ammon and Moab while besieging them. Commandment 577, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 7 to 8. Do not prevent a third-generation Egyptian convert from marrying into the Jewish people. Commandment 578, Devarim, chapter 23, verse 7 to 8. Do not refrain from marrying a third-generation Edomite convert. Commandment 579, Devarim, chapter 24, verse 1. Issue a divorce by means of a get document. Commandment 580. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 10. The creditor must not forcibly take collateral. Commandment 581. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 12. Do not delay return of collateral when needed. Commandment 582. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 13. Return the collateral to the debtor when needed. Commandment 583. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 15. Pay wages on the day they were earned. Commandment 584. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 16. Relatives of the litigants must not testify. Commandment 585. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 17. Do not demand collateral from a widow. Commandment 586. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 17. A judge must not pervert a case involving a convert or orphan. Commandment 587. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 19. Leave the forgotten sheaves in the field for the poor. Commandment 588. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 19. Do not retrieve sheaves forgotten in the field, but leave them for the poor. Commandment 589. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 4. A man must not remarry his ex-wife after she has married someone else. Commandment 590. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 5. He who has taken a wife, built a new home, or planted a vineyard is given a year to rejoice with his possessions. Commandment 591. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 5. Do not demand any communal or military involvement for 1 year. Commandment 592. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 6. Do not demand as collateral utensils needed for preparing food. Commandment 593. Devarim, chapter 24, verse 8. The unclean person must not remove his signs of impurity. Commandment 594. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 12. Save someone from being killed by a blood avenger, even if taking the life of the pursuer. Commandment 595. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 13. Do not possess inaccurate scales and weights, even if they are not for use. Commandment 596. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 17. Remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people. Commandment 597. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 19. Wipe out the descendants of Amalek. Commandment 598. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 19. Do not forget Amalek's atrocities and ambush on our journey from Egypt in the desert. Commandment 599. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 2. The court must give lashes to the wrongdoer. Commandment 600. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 3. The court must not exceed the prescribed number of lashes. Commandment 601. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 4. Do not muzzle an ox while plowing. Commandment 602. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 5. A man must marry the widow of his childless brother. Commandment 603. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 5. A childless widow must not remarry until the ties with her brother-in-law are removed. Commandment 604. Devarim, chapter 25, verse 9. A man must free the widow of his childless brother from the obligation to marry him if he is unwilling to marry her. Commandment 605. Devarim, chapter 26, verse 13. Read the confession of tithes every 4th and 7th year. Commandment 606. Devarim, chapter 26, verse 14. Do not spend the money from selling the second tithe on anything but food, drink, or ointment in Jerusalem. Commandment 607. Devarim, chapter 26, verse 14. Do not eat the second tithe while impure. Commandment 608. Devarim, chapter 26, verse 14. A mourner on the first day after a death must not eat the second tithe. Commandment 609. Devarim, chapter 26, verse 5. Read the portion of Scripture pertaining to the preservation of first fruits. Commandment 610. Devarim, chapter 28, verse 9. Emulate Adonai's ways. Commandment 611. Devarim, chapter 31, verse 10 to 12. Assemble all the people on the Feast of Tabernacles following the 7th year. Commandment 612. Devarim, chapter 31, verse 19. Each male must write a scroll of the Torah. Commandment 613. Devarim, chapter 32, verse 38. Do not drink wine poured in service to idols.